Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's so lovely to see you in the audience, and we're delighted that you are here today. My name is Kristen Mariah, and I'm an assistant professor at Queen's University, and I'm happy to welcome you to the second edition of the Black Studies Summer Seminar Lecture Series. The Black Studies Summer Seminar is a comprehensive one-week research intensive designed to produce generative and fruitful academic debates and professional development for PhD candidates and postdoctoral fellows, pre-tenure faculty, librarians, archivists, researchers, and artists. The goals of the seminar include the training and development of PhD candidates, the support and preparation of pre-tenure faculty, and the advancement of the field of Black Studies in Canada. Meeting daily for closed sessions during the week of June 6th, we also have 3 public events highlighting major thinkers in the field of Black Studies. I would like to note that today we have ASL services available, and if you require ASL services, please send Tech a direct message in the chat. And in addition, if at any point during the chat or during the Zoom lecture you have technical problems and need assistance, you can also message Tech. As we begin, I want to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The planning team could not do this alone, and many entities and individuals have been critical to the possibility of our success. And we would especially like to thank members of our planning committee, including Dr. Yolande Buka, Dr. Lauren McLeod Kramer, Mana Dahir, Mark Campbell, Rachel Goff, and many others. The Department of Art and Culture and Media at the University of Toronto Scarborough, the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University Library, the Agnes Etherington Art Center at Queen's University, the Black Faculty Network at the University of Toronto, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, the Digital Scholarship Unit at the University of Toronto Scarborough Library, and the Queen's Archives. And now it is my great honor to introduce our second keynote lecturer of the week, Dr. Annette Joseph Gabriel. Annette Joseph Gabriel is an associate professor of Romance Studies at Duke University, and her research focuses on race, gender, and citizenship in the French-speaking Caribbean, Africa, and France. She is the author of Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, published by the University of Illinois Press. And that book was awarded the Modern Language Association Prize for her first book and honorable mention for the Eugene Weber Award for Best Book in Modern French History. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals, including Small Acts, Slavery and Abolition, 18th Century Studies, and the French Review. And her public writing has been featured in Al Jazeera, HuffPost, and the Washington Post. She's a recipient of the Carrie Chapman Catt Prize for Research on Women in Politics. She is also incoming senior editor of Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International. Dr. Gabriel, we are incredible fans of your work. All of our participants have received a copy of Reimagining Liberation, and we are so thankful that you were able to be with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just gonna first share my screen as one does in Zoom events. Please let me know if you're able to see my PowerPoint. Okay, is it visible? Everyone? Yes, fantastic. Okay, great. So thank you so much to the organizers of the Black Studies Summer Seminar, Drs. Campbell, Mariah and Siad, and all the sponsors for the very kind invitation to be part of this conversation. I also want to thank everyone who's joined us today on Zoom. So I know that you all have copies of Reimagining Liberation. I'm actually going to be sharing from new work because I want to kind of, get into the spirit of a learning kind of event. And so I'm really looking forward to your feedback and to the conversation after. I also imagine that we will all have kind of different entry points into today's conversation. And so I want to invite everyone into a text as a way for us to kind of enter together. There'll be, lots of quotes on different slides. Each slide has a slide number. So if there's anything you want us to come back to, please feel free to jot down the slide numbers and we can return to that in Q&A. So the text is a quote from Derek Walcott's Nobel Prize speech that will serve as a through thread that runs through this talk. And so Walcott writes, "Break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. The glue that fits the pieces is the sealing of its original shape. It is such a love that reassembles our African and Asiatic fragments, the cracked heirlooms whose restoration shows its white scars. This gathering of broken pieces is the care and pain of the Antilles. And if the pieces are disparate, ill-fitting, they contain more pain than their original sculpture. Those icons and sacred vessels taken for granted in their ancestral places. Antillean art is this restoration of our shattered histories, our shards of vocabulary, our archipelago becoming a synonym for pieces broken off from the original continent." What happens if we take an enslaved child's account of himself as the starting point for telling his story? Jean Montague was an enslaved boy with a knack for running away. He undertook his first documented escape in the summer of 1780 from Paris to the suburb of Passy. His flight from his enslaver, the American naval captain William Robeson, did not lead to his freedom. Instead, he found himself in the grips of the law. Arrested and consigned to the Petit Châtelet, one of the most notorious dungeon prisons in Paris, Montague quickly realized that his initial state of unfreedom as Robeson's slave was now compounded by another form of captivity, that of prisoner of the French crown. Faced with one of two dire options for runaway slaves in France, be shipped to a life of hard labor in the colonies or die in prison, Montague made a surprising choice. He wrote a letter to the American minister plenipotentiary, then residing in Passy at the time, Benjamin Franklin, to negotiate his release. What is initially striking about Montague's story is that it resulted in an account of his life, supposedly written in his own hand. His letter to Franklin is a rich first-person narrative by an enslaved child that is all the more rare because it was penned in French. It is as follows. So I'm going to kind of read the letter in the French original because the English translation is my translation and you're welcome to follow along in the English translation. But there are some things that were really difficult to translate and I want to kind of pull those words out and work with them. So I'm breaking all the PowerPoint rules, 2 giant walls of text, but really just follow along on one half or the other. So Montague writes to Franklin, "Monseigneur, j'ai l'honneur de vous assurer de mon très humble respect. J'ai celui de vous faire savoir que j'appartiens à Monsieur le capitaine Robeson. Il m'a fait des menaces de me frapper. Pour lors, j'ai trouvé Monsieur Tessier gentilhomme qui désire faire mon bonheur. Monsieur Robeson l'a su et m'a fait arrêter et constituer prisonnier au Petit Châtelet parce que le commissaire lui a dit qu'il n'y avait pas d'esclaves en France. Je ne demande pas mieux de rentrer chez Monsieur Robeson parce que si je n'avais pas été détournée par Monsieur Tessier, je n'aurais jamais sorti. Je vous supplie, Monseigneur, de vouloir bien faire mes excuses à Monsieur Robeson et que je ferai tout ce qu'il dépendra de moi pour le contenter. C'était qu'il voulait me faire baptiser. J'espère de vos bontés que vous voudrez bien me faire rendre justice. Il y a de ma faute de peu d'expérience que j'ai, n'étant pas avancé en âge. Je réitère de vous supplier de vouloir bien parler pour moi à Monsieur Robeson. Je vous en serai toute ma vie reconnaissant et vous supplie de me croire avec tout le respect qui vous est dû, en attendant une petite réponse, monseigneur, votre très humble et très obéissant serviteur, soumis, Jean, nègre de Monsieur Robson. Montague's letter to Franklin provides a glimpse into his life as a young person whose survival and coming of age depended on his ability to carefully navigate the legality of his enslavement in a country that interdicted slavery on its soil, right? So you'll see here, for example, his ventriloquizing the police commissioner to say there are no slaves in France, which technically, legally, yes, and also no, right? It's kind of complicated. So his letter attests to the complexity of that legal terrain and to the realities of corporal punishment and incarceration that underpinned the disavowed but very real practice of slavery in France. His letter is also an account that immediately frustrates any attempts to reconstruct a coherent narrative about Montague's life. Muddled tenses obscure the chronology of events, rendering causality difficult to determine. So for example, right in the beginning, he introduces himself, says he belongs to Robson. Robson threatened to beat him. And so he ran away to find Monsieur Tessier-Gentilhomme, right? I have translated pour law. First, I have rendered it into our contemporary parlance as alors, right? And then translated that as and so, which establishes causality, right? Robson threatened to beat me, and so I went and found Tessier-Gentilhomme. But if you look at the Dictionnaire d'autrefois, right, the old-timey dictionary, pour law then also meant at that time, right? And so Robson threatened to beat me. At that time, I found this other person, right? Which is no longer causality, but simultaneity. And there are lots of slippages like this, which ultimately end up rendering this letter useless as a confession or an admission of guilt, which I think is strategic on Montague's part. And so throughout the letter, Montague's vague language and reliance on euphemisms about going away with a nobleman camouflage what was in fact a conveniently timed escape from his enslaver the night before Robson was to set sail from France to America. The task of reconstituting the fragmented tale recounted in Montague's letter into an account of his life is fraught with peril. When recovering enslaved people's narratives, our desire for wholeness is often a desire for healing. We recuperate the life of an enslaved boy on the run by lovingly reassembling the pieces of his narrative. That such work, invested as it is in repair, redemption, and recuperation, is risky and largely impossible, has been amply explored in scholarship, right? So metaphors abound for the inevitable losses, absences, and silences that mark the stories salvaged from slavery's archive. Derek Walcott, like we saw in the beginning, imagines the fragments of Antillean history as pieces of a broken vase, the act of restoration through art as an act of care. This fragmentation in turn shapes the stories that can and cannot be told about the slave past. We read along the biased grain in order to disrupt the representational power of the enslaver's record. We engage in critical fabulation to write a collective biography of dead subjects that aims to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible. Taken together, these carefully devised modes of counter-reading the archive, both despite and because of the impossibility of doing so, show the ever-present tension between the reality of fragmentation and our reaching for wholeness. Alongside Black Atlantic historical projects that are animated by the question of whether we can recover the histories, lives, and voices of enslaved people, it's a current of scholarship that questions whether we should. So, for example, as Helton and others note, if recovery does not have a political purpose beyond documenting Black presence, then it becomes merely a plea for inclusion within the foundational promises of liberal modernity. Stephen Best in turn explores what might be productive about the refusal of recovery. He contends that the impetus behind the recovery imperative is the idea that recovery from the slave past rests on a recovery of it. Best is particularly critical of what he terms melancholy historicism, which provides for the view that history consists in the taking possession of such grievous experience and archival loss. And so the alternative, right, to recovery, the alternative to melancholy historicism that Best offers is, quote, certainly not history writing as we know it, but a writing in full awareness of the negativity that labors to undo any historical project. These astute evaluations of the limits of recovery in Black Atlantic history inform my own reading of Montague's letter. In particular, Best's inquiry into, quote, what it would mean to write about figures who resist our attempts to restore them to wholeness. Read in conjunction with Lisa Lowe's articulation of hesitation as a stance that does not move, quote, immediately toward recovery, serve as a critical apparatus for reading Montague's letter beyond the recovery mode. At the same time, I'm also interested in what lies beyond dichotomies. And by this, I mean that I'm trained in literary studies by Black women scholars who taught me to anchor my literary analysis always in historical reading, right? And so I'm not interested in this kind of like antagonistic relationship between recovery or not, or, you know, history's methodological limitations kind of compensated for in art and literature. Rather, along with thinkers like Jenny Sharp in Immaterial Archives, for example, I want to consider a less oppositional relationship between recovery and fragmentation, and between a historically grounded reading and attention to narrative form. And so to do that, I return to Walcott, right? In Walcott's reflection on history and narrative, the extended metaphor of the vase begins with a puzzling command: break a vase. We imagine that artists and historians come to meet the vase of Antillean history already broken by the slave trade, slavery, and their attendant violent erasures. Yet issued in the imperative, break a vase implicates us as contemporary participants in this deeply ambivalent account of recovery that begins and ends with fragments, right? So if you look at this paragraph here, you know, even after Walcott talks about the restoration of our shattered histories, the Antilles become or remain in the end of the paragraph a synonym for pieces broken off from the original continent. And this, Walcott says, is the exact process of the making of poetry. The sometimes ambivalent, sometimes antagonistic, always dynamic interplay of historical recovery and fragmentation is akin to the Antillean poet's own process of assembling, stripping down, reassembling language that has dissolved from the exhaustion of trying to cross an ocean. Entwined in this way with a poetic process, the question of recovery exceeds the paradox of whether or not to attempt it despite its impossibility. It nudges us to interrogate the ends of our counter-reading of slavery's archive and to consider the creative narrative possibilities that memory work may offer beyond the documentary ends of recovery. To retrieve something of Montague's life story, that is, to undertake a historical project of recovery in the biographical mode, of course, is to inevitably contend with the paucity of documents that renders recovery impossible. But the reason for my hesitation at recovery, right, the reason why I hesitate in immediately trying to recover something of Montague from his letter is not entirely the lack of sources. What gives me pause when faced with that single archival fragment that is Montague's letter to Franklin is the peculiar way in which he is present in the archive. There is at once too much and too little of Jean Montague. I first encountered Montague in the William Temple Franklin papers held at the American Philosophical Society Library. I sat in the library's reading room in 2017, beneath a room designed to resemble Benjamin Franklin's personal library, complete with books once owned by the great American statesman. I gingerly held the enslaved boy's letter and traced with my finger the small tears in the paper. I wondered who had written Montague's address in the top left corner in darker ink and in handwriting markedly different from the rest of the letter. Jean, nègre de Monsieur Robson, du Petit Châtelet, 25 juin 1780, right? So his address is the prison. The elegance of the cursive script is still today unable to mask the brutality of Montague's confinement in the prison. The material object bears witness to the ways that enslaved people's narratives come to us as degraded and mediated fragments. I did not immediately write about Montague then. Years later, I encountered him again, this time in 3 places at once. In the 38th volume of the printed collection, The Papers of Benjamin Franklin, published by Yale University Press, right? So there's the letter reprinted in that collection. Then in the digital repository, The Papers of Benjamin Franklin, co-sponsored by the APS and Yale University. So that's the digital repository, that's the letter again. And finally, in the Founders Online Database, a collaborative project between the National Archives and the University of Virginia Press. The document I had held at the APS served as the source material for these reproductions. Montague's letter is today reproduced threefold, no longer confined to Temple Franklin's papers, but now transferred also to Benjamin Franklin's digital and print archive. Searching for the traces that the enslaved boy left about himself does not lead to multiple fragments that we may fit together to recompose the vase. Instead, we just get the same fragment again and again. What is the story to be told? The replication of Montague's letter across several institutional archives amplifies the magnitude of loss. Beyond his letter to Franklin, there is no more Montague to be recovered in the first person. And we are reminded of that, not once or twice, but countless times, as his letter makes its way from Passy, where Temple received it in 1780, to Champlot, where Temple's and Franklin's papers were stored by the Fox family in the 19th century, to Philadelphia, where the APS obtained the papers in the 20th century, to New Haven, where Yale University Press is located, to College Park, to Charlottesville, to an entire world via the internet in the 21st century. To pay critical attention to this amplified loss is to privilege what we might glean from repeated returns to the letter as the narrative fragment of Montague's irrecoverable story. In reading Montague's letter then, I aim to fit the pieces of his life story together in defiance of the archive's fragmentation and break it apart again in recognition of the fragmentary nature of his own recounting of his escape. Break a vase. So let us begin again with a story that is deceptively whole. On June 1, 1780, Captain William Robeson of the South Carolina Navy wrote 3 desperate letters from Paris. The first was to Franklin's grandson and secretary, William Temple Franklin, requesting the elder Franklin's aid in capturing, quote, a little Negro boy, formerly the property of Mr. Amiel, who last night thought proper to step on one side. Most likely he may stray toward Passy, it's having been the place of his former master's residence. The boy's name is Montague. By escaping the night before he was to depart with Robeson from Paris to the port of Lorient to board a ship that would take him into a life of slavery in the United States, the enslaved boy had apparently carefully timed his flight to maximize the chances that his enslaver would be compelled to leave France without him. Because of this strategically inconvenient timing, Robeson's second letter was to the statesman John Adams, leaving instructions for what to do with Montague should he be captured after Robeson had left France. In his third correspondence, Robeson did what any American enslaver in his situation would do. He contacted the police. But Paris was not South Carolina, and Robeson had severely misjudged the complexity of the delicate negotiation between French legal interdictions of slavery and the unspoken social codes that continued to perpetuate Black subjugation, which made it possible for him to purchase an enslaved boy in a country that operated on the freedom principle. That is, quote, the notion that any slave who sets foot on French soil becomes free. Despite this legal opening afforded by the French freedom principle, freedom remained beyond Montague's grasp. Benjamin Franklin intervened on his enslaver's behalf, personally urging the Lieutenant General of Police to aid Robeson in retrieving that to which he was entitled by law and by equity. Les lois et l'équité, Franklin writes to the police. The Paris police soon apprehended Montague and put him in the Petit Châtelet prison. By contacting the police, Robeson had not only complicated things for himself, right? Because when a fugitive slave is apprehended in France at the time, they are remanded into custody and then shipped off to the colonies for the profit of the king, right? So Robeson had essentially lost Montague, and it was really through Franklin's intervention that he gets him back. So he had complicated things for himself, but he had also complicated them for Montague. Escaping from an American in Paris was easier than breaking out of a French prison, particularly one that was so notorious for its dangerous conditions that it would be demolished on the king's orders less than 2 years after Montague's incarceration. So when you look at historical accounts of what the Petit Châtelet was like at the time, right, they describe deadly conditions in, quote, 3 dungeons or châtres basses, where the prisoners would not survive long for want of air. In this desperate situation, Montague decided to negotiate his release from prison, even if it meant a return to slavery. He did so in his letter to Franklin that we just read. 3 months later, we learn that Montague had been returned to Robeson, who in turn carried him away to the port city of Nantes, quote, in the bottom of his post-chaise. So Robeson put him in the bottom of his carriage and took him to Nantes. Montague's flight, capture, imprisonment, and release back into slavery had lasted from the summer until early fall of 1780. By then, Robeson had become exceedingly anxious to return to the United States. With Montague in tow, he boarded the ship the Marquis Lafayette, which departed Lorient on March 31, 1781. About a month into its voyage, the Marquis Lafayette was attacked by a Jamaica fleet and destroyed at sea. The vessel's remains were towed to Leith Roads off the coast of Scotland. Robeson's misfortune was fortuitous for Montague. The enslaved boy escaped again, back to Passy, this time from England. In Passy, Montague once again found himself in the Franklin household, whereupon he relayed to Robeson that freedom, quote, was his due immediately on his arrival in England, which suggests that not only was he aware of the freedom principle in France, but also of the Somerset ruling, right, in England. A French acquaintance warned Benjamin Franklin to hold fast to, quote, the young Negro who all the maréchaussée, the French militia, is charged to arrest. By 1782, Montague was once again in Robeson's possession. Franklin's grandnephew, Jonathan Williams Jr., who would go on to become the first superintendent of West Point, had purchased a ship named the Spry and placed it under Robeson's command, facilitating the captain's long-awaited return to the United States. Again, carefully timing his flight, Montague escaped a third time, just as Robeson was ready to set sail. I am really rooting for this boy at this point. Robeson had no choice but to leave France and return to the United States without his captive. Now, up until now, I have told you that Montague is an enslaved boy, a child, young. I have not yet told you how young. When Montague fled Robeson a third time, Williams Jr. informed an associate that, big chunk of text, but divided into two, right? Follow along either in the French original or the English translation below. Williams Jr. said, quote, a slave servant of Captain Robeson of the Spry vient de voler son maître et de s'enfuir, à ce qu'on soupçonne, par le chemin de, I think that's Bordeaux. C'est un garçon de 16 à 18 ans, bien fait, mais court, parle français et anglais et se vante souvent d'être né à la Jamaïque. Il a un habit bleu avec un culotte rouge et il a un corps de chasse avec lui. Tell the militia to arrest him. Now, as a literary scholar, language always hits me first. There are several letters like these in the archives where these prominent Americans are hunting down this boy, and they switch back and forth between English and their fledgling French, and they boast about their mastery of the French language, like in the same breath. There is a connection between their mastery of another language and their domination of this bilingual Black boy that is worth exploring in further detail. Meanwhile, Montague, who was still in Paris, appeared before the Admiralty of France on August 14, 1782, to declare his presence on French soil in accordance with the law. So his declaration is as follows. Est comparu au greffe Jean Montague Nègre, demeurant à Paris, rue des Approuverts, maison de Monsieur Collat, expert écrivain, lequel a déclaré être âgé de 10 ans, être né à Saint-Domingue, passé en France en juillet dernier par un paquebot anglais, dont il a requis acte et a déclaré ne savoir signer. There is much to say about age here. And unfortunately, I won't have the time to say any of it, but I'm going to open up that door for Q&A. But I want to signal at least two things here, right? First, I was having a conversation with an archivist at the Beinecke, and she said, well, there is no way that a boy of 16 or 18, right, Williams Jr., could pass for 10. So the Montague who made this declaration to the Admiralty is not the Montague that these people have been tracking. But at the same time, we know that white slaveholders were notoriously bad at estimating Black age. And so at this point, I want to add to our collective bibliography, Black Age by Habiba Ibrahim, which is what I'm going to be reading next. So I would love to read that with you all, right? And that Williams Jr. himself concedes, if you look at his physical description of Montague here, right, that he is short. So his small body gets in the way of the political investment that Williams has in aging him up so that he can then project onto him, right, attributes to him all manner of wicked deeds. Williams calls him wicked, attributes a whole mutiny in international waters, we'll see that later, to a Black boy who was probably just 10 years old. But the thing that I love about that back and forth with the archivist today, right, is that Montague even now continues to frustrate and evade us, the fugitive account, by not showing up or presenting himself how we think he should. So like if you follow the references to his age chronologically as they appear in the archives, right, he keeps getting younger instead of older. Right? So he's 16 to 18, then he's 10, and then later on we'll see him referred to as, you know, a little boy again, right? Which means, to add to our collective bibliography, we have to turn to Michelle Wright's Physics of Blackness, right? To think about how her formulation of space-time can be brought to bear here to trouble that linear progression of aging from childhood to adulthood, which in Montague's time is also very entwined with Enlightenment projects of the perfectibility of man. Disrupt that linearity of age. Break a vase. But let me bracket this discussion of age off for a minute because we are nearly at the end of Montague's story. We have left Robeson in Philadelphia. And by now, surely Montague hopes that the freedom that France promises is finally within reach, with his enslaver an ocean away and his presence duly recorded by the Paris courts. That hope proved illusory. When I tell you all these powerful American statesmen were hunting this boy down, barely a month after his appearance before the Admiralty, we find him aboard yet another American vessel, the Trio, with a ship's captain charged by Williams Jr. to hold the boy until he could be claimed by Robeson on American shores. But as David Wallstreicher remarks, Montague never went anywhere easily. There was a revolt aboard the Trio, and the mutineers commandeered the vessel to Kinsale, Ireland. The British press identified 3 English prisoners as the enslavers of the revolt. Robeson and Williams Jr. maintained that the bilingual Montague was the leader of the mutiny, that he single-handedly carried the ship to Ireland. After this condemnation by his enslaver, we hear nothing more of Jean Montague. This version of Montague's life reconstitutes the fragment of his story into a narrative that appears whole. But is it not an illusion of wholeness offered by the comforting linearity of chronology? A linearity that the enslaved boy's own convoluted letter and repeated returns to Passy belie? Montague erupts into Franklin's archive in the flurry of urgent letters that led to his first documented capture in 1780 and disappears from the written record just as suddenly in 1783. Surely it is understandable to wish completion for this story that has no conclusion, ending as it does with Montague in mid-flight. We might hope that the enslaved boy's abrupt exit from Franklin's papers marked his ultimate liberation from the clutches of his enslaver through a final successful escape from Ireland. Alternatively, if we imagine that his repeated flight over the 2 documented years of his life were a pattern, then the only possible conclusion is none at all. Montague simply keeps running, and his fugitivity exceeds the bounds of Franklin's archive. What happens when we take an enslaved boy's account of himself as the starting point for telling his story? To ask this question is to contemplate what is at stake in archival recovery and to consider what promises and perils lie within the generic boundaries of biography as the means for recovering enslaved personhood. What is to be done with these fragments that I've tried to suture together for you? What can be salvaged from the brutal violence that attends these shards of a life that characterizes the moments we glimpse Montague in a prison dungeon, in the bottom of the post-chaise, apprehended by police, about to be beaten by Robeson? What, if anything, is to be recovered? Imagine that you are a reader rather than a listener of this oral tale. When you read Montague's story, what do you not see? What lies beyond your view? Break a vase. Considering the many gaps in the enslaved boy's story underscores the fact that the violence in the act of breaking the vase is not only the initial fragmentation of the slave past, it is also the story that the fragmentation would compel us to tell. Consider, for example, Robeson's speculation about the destination and implicit motive for Montague's first escape. Most likely, he may stray toward Passy, its having been the place of his former master's residence. Any possibilities for a genealogy or kinship at Passy, for flight that has meaning beyond a return to the master, are foreclosed by Robeson's rhetorical intervention, by his marking of the Parisian suburb as the place of his former master's residence. What is freedom if it is composed of repeated returns to a place that we can only see as the site of enslavement? The impulse to recover the past would have us wrest Passy from Robeson's discursive intervention and imbue the site with new meaning. To recover Passy for Montague, we must read it as what Stephanie Camp, building on Edward Said, has termed a rival geography, alternative ways of knowing and using plantation and southern space that conflicted with planters' ideals and demands. So the fixity and constraints of sites of enslavement become, in the rival geography, an emphasis on motion, the movement of bodies, objects, and information. To recover Passy for Montague would mean that we too would undertake this interpretive act of reversal in our present, reading the space otherwise, no longer as solely the site of his bondage, but also as a space in which some form of freedom might be imagined. We might read Montague's constant returns in the Caribbean tradition of marronage, perhaps like the enslaved people on Caribbean plantations who engage in the cycles of escape and return that characterize petit marronage. Montague too kept trying to return to a loved one in Passy from whom he could not bear to be parted. Alternatively, we might consider Passy a site for grand marronage, with the suburbs' proximity to anti-slavery networks in Paris, representing Montague's only real chance of permanently escaping bondage. Alongside these very necessary speculative moves, I want to suggest another, the value of the unknowable. It is not simply that we do not know what Passy symbolized for Montague because there are not enough surviving historical documents to reveal this to us. It is also that we cannot know what Passy meant to him. What is occasioned by the loss, the disappearance of this information that is critical to deciphering the enslaved boy's motives? In Montague's fugitive account, the unknowability of Passy makes him the bearer of a knowledge that eludes attempts to apprehend him by his enslavers who sought to capture him then, and by us who seek to know him now. His marronage back to the site of enslavement unsettles the linear progression of liberal narratives of freedom that move teleologically towards the autonomy of the individual as political and economic subject. I'm almost at the end of my time. So if you have the bandwidth for a final version of Montague's story, we begin a final time at a beginning that is located neither in knowledge nor in unknowability, but rather simply in fragments. I turn to the finding aid as an artifact of ordering and locating subjects and lives in the archive, an artifact that quickly falls apart in its function when we search for enslaved people's presence, right? We know this. We know that finding aids can be pretty useless sometimes when it comes to trying to find enslaved people's presence in the archives. But in trying to see how far I can take this line of thinking of the fugitive account as a way of working within and against and beyond recovery, I want to consider what a finding aid would look like when written from within the space of Montague's fugitive account. So I'm going to read for you 3 versions. The first is the actual catalog description about Montague that the editors of the Benjamin Franklin papers wrote and appended to his letter in the print volume. So I consider that the official version. The second version is my version, what I think a finding aid would look like if we stand in the space of this chapter and look out. And the third version is neither Montague's voice nor perspective, but rather what a finding aid would look like if we stand in the space of his letter to Franklin and look out. Now, before I do that, I want to just ask the tech person, I'm going to have to disconnect the screen that I'm sharing because I have a wonky setup and I need to charge my laptop before I die on you. So I'm wondering if you can pull up the second to last slide on the PowerPoint, if that's possible, while I plug my computer in. Fantastic, yes, thank you. Okay, all right. So, version 1, this is the official version. In the summer of 1780, Franklin and his grandson Temple apparently helped in the recovery of a runaway slave, Mr. Montague. Few letters to or from Franklin survive to illuminate the story, but the extant documents indicate that he wrote to the head of the Paris police, asking him to help Captain Robeson of the South Carolina Navy in recapturing the man. 3 days later, Montague himself, signing his letter Jean, sent Franklin an eloquent plea to be released from the Petit Châtelet. The tale is fragmentary but intriguing and will unfold in future volumes. That's version 1, Franklin as the protagonist. Version 2, next slide, please. So this is my version. What is a finding aid for you who will not be found? Is it a guide to friable fragments that did not cross the ocean? It would catalog the places where you were not, call numbers to find names that were not yours. What must he have felt? A young man so far from home, not even to be called by his own name. The null value records your fugitive presence, glimpsed in the moment before recovery. In your finding aid, there are no dates that chronicle or ledgers that tally. There is only a map of retour and détour that lead to Passy in the Caribbean, a list of pursuers to be led astray, a chart of signs that never converge. The legend is decipherable only to you. So is this a not finding aid or a guide to fugitivity à l'infini? Version 3 is not on the slide. It's just to be taken in kind of audibly. He went to Passy, he flew to London. With a blast of its hunting horn, he summoned a fleet from Jamaica to carry him to Saint-Domingue. Jean Montague sank a ship. Jean Montague rose against captains in mutiny. Jean Montague in the ship's hold, in the carriage bottom, in the prison dungeon. Break a vase. Jean is not your Negro. Break a vase. Jean and Montague are not the same. What good is your finding aid now? Okay, so I'm gonna stop here. Thank you all so very much for listening, and I am eager for our conversation.
I'm so overwhelmed. Thank you so much. This is truly amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are going to invite those of us, our guests who are joining us online, to put their questions in the chat. People who are in person right now at U of T Scarborough, if you have questions, feel free to make your way towards the front of the room. I have chills right now and goosebumps. I just have so many questions coming from your talk, but one of the things I would love to hear more from you comes from your own suggestions. I want to know more about age, right, and this issue of actually, and boyhood in terms of your theorization of Jean Montague.
Yeah, so you have asked the question that I'm the least prepared to answer, and I see Dr. Halliday in the chat, who is the childhood studies scholar in my intellectual universe. I mean, I think so age is important to me for multiple reasons. One, I didn't actually know how to see young people. Like if you give me a historical account and like women are there in particular kind of ways, I have a framework for thinking about gender very readily. I did not have as ready a framework about thinking about age until in that APS, the time I found Montague. I was giving a talk at the APS and I was like, here's my snazzy little PowerPoint with all these enslaved people moving around the globe. And Dr. Nazira Wright was in the audience and she said, are you aware that all the people you've talked about are young people? And I was like, looking at my PowerPoint like, oh, okay, right. And she was like, do you know how to think about age? You know how to think with age, right? And so I've been I've been working on that up until now. And so essentially this what I've read for you today is an excerpt from a chapter from this larger book project that is about enslaved children, and how enslaved children, when we pay attention to what they write, how they think, how they move, help us to read the past differently, right? So Montague is fugitive accounts. Someone else is helping us to read obliquely or read askance, right? So there are multiple reading frameworks that emerge. The thing about age for Montague that's interesting is that age becomes his out. It becomes his claim to humanity, right? He says, I ran away because this person lured me away, led me astray. And I really wouldn't have done that, except I'm inexperienced. I am, right, not advanced in age. So if he cannot access humanity through race, he will at least, right, so he cannot access that legal innocence. He will at least make that claim to moral innocence, right, through age. And so I have said that, Williams Jr. had this political investment in aging him up, but Montague himself may also very well have had a political investment in aging himself down, right? I mean, there's a big discrepancy between like 18 and 10, although I really do not trust Jonathan Williams Jr. at all. Like, that man was sleazy and also not very bright. Let me not slander people's founding fathers in my talk, because this is gonna be recorded. But but I also don't want to romanticize it, because Montague himself also might have that investment in aging himself down, maybe as a way to elicit, right, like the protection of the courts or of whatever benefactors he might have had in an anti-slavery network. So age is never neutral or benign, right? It is always a political claim, and particularly in the context of slavery, in navigating one's freedom, where age becomes not just a legal question, but also a question of social perception, right? Who is entitled to protection, who might be seen as wicked or as corrupted or corruptible, or can be salvaged or saved, right? Because there is nothing that white European Enlightenment man loves more than to bring the other into the orbit of Enlightenment, right? Never quite attaining it, but into the orbit. That's a testament to Enlightenment man's own kind of, power and magnanimity. And so Montague, by being really tricky with age there, is actually, I think, kind of pushing back against a lot of the ways that we think about youth, about childhood, because he does not always get the benefit, right, of how one might read youth at that time. And so, he tries to take back that benefit. But we'll never know how old he is unless I don't know what kind of document one might find that would be so disinterested, but I think, that the unknowability of his age there too, right, allows us to do really interesting kind of interpretive things.
This is incredible. And as our anonymous attendee has said in the Q&A, wow. Could you please speak more about the use of critical fabulation and speculation in telling fugitive accounts? Right? And this is so great, actually thinking about like what it means to like find that one document, right, or not find that one document, right, that attests to age. Right?
Yeah. So the thing about critical fabulation, every time I give this talk, the historians in the room are like, okay, here are 25,000 questions about context, right? Like, do the critical fabulation and fill in the world, right, around Montague. And I'm like, yes, but also what I'm trying to figure out is what happens when we do other things as well, right? So what I find particularly generative about critical fabulation is that it is one way of marking presence in ways where, ledgers and charts and enslavers' documents claim absence or claim nothing but objecthood, right? Critical fabulation allows us to fill in some of those things. And if anybody here like follows me on Twitter, you know that I've been like struggling with Stephen Best's critique, right, of critical fabulation as one example of melancholy historicism, as one kind of focus on recovery that forecloses other things. Like I said, I'm not trying to, be like, so let's not do recovery, let's do something else, but to think about what putting all of those possible, right, interpretive moves, juxtaposing them gets us. So what I would say, I guess, if I go back to the question about critical fabulation, is that, I do that work of speculation, right? That's the first version of the story, and it's the longest version, tellingly, right? But then I want to go and just kind of break it apart again and see what happens if we we don't tell the story. We just take up the fragments and look at them and think about what the loss of the things around those fragments also get us, right? So that's what Walcott describes as the glue, right? The sort of the white spaces between the pieces of the reconstructed vase. I'm interested not in putting the pieces together only, but in contemplating those white lines to see what they might tell us.
Incredible. We have another anonymous question in the Q&A box. It says, I am curious about what, if anything, the descriptions of his claim to having been born in Jamaica might mean, mindful of maroon history there.
Yeah, I don't know if Montague was actually born in Jamaica, because then he tells the court that he was born in Saint-Domingue, right? But the thing that is key here is Jonathan Williams Jr. says, il se vante d'être né à la Jamaïque. He boasts of being born in Jamaica, right? That is not just a claim, it's a boast. My suspicion there is that Montague is carefully speaking himself into a different kind of juridical regime outside of France's legal power, right? So like if you're born in Jamaica, then you are not a subject of the French Empire. So, who has legal claim over you is actually not these Americans or these French people, but, some empire far away, right? It is only when he returns from England, which would have had legal claim over him, that he says, oh, I was born in Saint-Domingue, right? So like, his legal claims, his different geographies definitely put him under different kind of jurisdictions, which might be strategic, or he might just have really enjoyed messing with people. I mean, there's a lot in the letters that suggest that Montague just really liked messing with people. And it is difficult for us to think about like something that is so frivolous and playful in the deadly conditions of slavery, right? But there is also, I think, something to be thought about there with play, which childhood scholars do a really great job of. And so I want to turn to, folks like Crystal Weber and how she thinks about play. But yeah, so all of that to say, I think that's what's happening with the claim about Jamaica. And alternatively, also the claim about Saint-Domingue is that Montague is really just trying to figure out which empire gives me the best chance of survival in the moment of that declaration.
Hey, our chat is popping. We've got a question from Aria Holiday, and she says, I'm wondering about unknowability and the thoughts you provided about how Montague shows up for us. What are the stakes for us in a contemporary moment for recovering children that even in today's context would be unknown? Why should we want to know Montague, even in the impossible/fragmented ways that we are given via the archive?
Oh, okay. That is a great question. I'm going to answer the question slightly obliquely, but I will attempt to bring it all together. So my feeling is that Montague does not want to be known then, and probably still likely now. And so what I'm trying to do in this chapter is to consider fruitful and productive ways of unknowing him, of not knowing him. So, for example, before this chapter ended with the 3 finding aids, it actually ended with the sentence, what happened to we take enslaved boy's account of himself as the starting point for telling his story. Jean Montague must have the last word. Like I was adamant that Montague must end this chapter, but I didn't know how, right? And so my editor said, well, write to him. And I was like, ooh, I have to write this boy a letter. He'll make fun of me. Like he'll be like, you don't know me. You can't speak to me. You can't write me. You don't know me, right? There's that presumed intimacy between past and present. That something like the afterlives of slavery, right, gets us, right? There's this kind of intimacy that I, again, want to maybe trouble a little bit. So I thought a lot about this unknowability, right? Montague kept telling me, you can't write me because you don't know me. And I realized that I kept trying to write him a letter because that was the only form of address that I knew. That's how you speak to somebody in writing. You write them a letter, right? So you'll notice that the finding aid, the third version, which is really my writing to Montague, is written in the third person. I cannot address him as you because, again, that unknowability. I cannot speak for him in the I. I can only come at him obliquely, right? Reading askance is my argument in the next chapter. That's the closest. That's for me the only ethical posture before those fragments. It's coming at it obliquely and being honest about the jarring and discordant nature of the moves between past and present. It is not as easy and seamless as something like the afterlife of slavery suggests, I think, right? So I know I've kind of answered your question, in a roundabout way, but why should we want to know Montague? I think we should want to know him because he allows us to be honest, like brutally honest about the limits of our capacity to know, not just because the archives are scant, but because of our own, I think, intellectual framework sometimes, and because of, right, those broken lines between past and present. But it's something I'm still kind of thinking through, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts about that as well.
We have a question from one of our participants, Kamisha Siblis, in the chat, and she asks or says, exactly, age is always political, as is everything in social life. So about your quote, about seeking to excavate these lives/narratives, such Fugitive's account as destructive, such counterproductive, if not political, even that is political. Do you feel we can ever reconstruct apolitically?
That's interesting. So one of the things I like adding to our collective bibliography, so I'm going to add the article, The Question of Recovery, an Introduction by Laura Helton, and the co-editors of that special issue of Social Text, because they were kind of going on about, recovery is suspect, right? Like I did that whole spiel, right? Recovery is suspect, here are the limits. And then they were like, but then we also talked to we talked to a senior scholar, and he was like, but there's a real political imperative behind that, right? Like people weren't just trying to recover the past because they didn't know any better, right? Like there's a real political imperative because Hegel banished Black people from history, right? Any writing of Black people back into history or against history, et cetera, is always going to be a political act. And I don't think that we do anything apolitically, or that we should even strive for that. I think that rather thinking both recovery and fragmentation as political things, as a political imperative, right? For repair, for troubling repair, for showing the limits of repair, right? That political imperative remains, I think, crucial as an animating force in our work. So I think that's what I would say about that. But again, a thought-provoking question. I need to think more about that.
Fantastic. Right. Yamafi in the Q&A box asks or says, such an insightful talk. Can you talk more about what is freedom and how freedom is not the linear concept we're used to? You've given us so much to think about. Wow.
Okay, so hi, Bright, first of all. I'm struggling with that part of the chapter, to be honest, because, okay, Neil Roberts' Freedom as Marronage, right? So another place we go to think about freedom. But because the thing is, what is freedom for Montague? Okay, here's my claim. My claim, if you go back to Montague's letter, right? If you recall one of the earlier slides with his letter on it, why did he run? He said he ran away to be happy. He found Monsieur Tessier Gentilhomme, who wanted to make him happy. He never says he ran to be free, right? We think automatically of freedom as the antithesis of slavery, right? One runs away to be free. Montague says, I ran to be happy. He writes this 4 years after, Franklin and others have appended their signature to the US Declaration of Independence that conjoins life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does it mean then to think about this boy's pursuit of happiness, or his flight towards happiness, right? In that same intellectual tradition, so that then, the definers of liberty and happiness are no longer just Jefferson and Franklin and others, but also Jean Montague, right? A possibly 10-year-old boy in a prison dungeon in Paris. What is freedom? So then freedom for Montague becomes also conjoined with happiness. And so from there, the chapter gets really unwieldy. My editor is like, no, you need to cut this out. But I'm like, listen, if we go, it's like, that meme on Twitter where the guy's like, and all the things connect, right? But if you think about Sarah Ahmed writing about affective economies, right? Montague turns to affect. And Sarah Ahmed writes about affective economies as, affect is what is an act of world making. We think about happiness always as pursuit. We run after happiness and we attain it. But for Montague, if we sit in Ahmed's framing of world making and we think about Montague is literally making a world, right? What is that world going to be composed of? It is going to be composed of a refusal of that bondage, of that captivity, but it's also a claiming of happiness, right? He ran to be free. He's making a new world order in his mind. That's kind of where I am with that thinking so far. So freedom for me right now, for Montague, is really intertwined with happiness, in ways that I think that we need to think about more, and that we can turn to Afro-diasporic kind of theoretical frameworks to think about more deeply.
Amazing. Thank you so much. In the chat, Aisha asks, I'm curious to know where you feel a kinship to Montague, if at all, and how that might have played into whether aiding or detracting from your storytelling. Also, is there a reason why so much trouble was gone through for such a young enslaved boy?
Okay, so let me start with the second question first. It's baffling. Isn't it baffling? I mean, they were just obsessed with this boy. There are letters where like an American statesman is like, I have seen this boy in Paris, but it turns out he's not even in Paris. They were just so obsessed with him. They were seeing him where he was not. Why did they go through so much trouble and expense? So, there's a whole section of the chapter where I talk about Robeson's debt. He becomes increasingly in debt because every time they have to chase this boy, capture him, house him, feed him, pay people, right? Like Robeson would just kept getting into increasing debt. And so a lot of the things that are coded in the archives as letters, as correspondence, are actually bills of exchange, right? It is really a transaction that is what anchors Montague in the archives. Not only that initial transaction of his purchase, but also the continued transaction of his continued capture. Why go through so much trouble and expense? Far more than, my editor says, far more than he was worth. I'm like, ooh, now I have to get into like slavery's accounting and value his life, right? And then measure that. And that makes me deeply uncomfortable. But here's what I learned to answer your question, Aisha. When Jonathan Williams Jr. says, this boy is the one who took my ship and carried it to Ireland, and Benjamin Franklin was like, okay, that's a little stupid. But he said, this boy took my ship and carried it to Ireland. He said it was not the English prisoners aboard the ship, that had there been English prisoners who undertook the mutiny, their natural desire for liberty, right? He says, so natural to man, capital M, thanks Sylvia Wynter, right? Their natural desire for liberty, I would have chalked this up to just misfortune. He said, I would have understood the loss of my ship if those white English prisoners had tried to get free and carried it away. But it is Montague, he says, it is the Negro's known wickedness that makes me believe that he is the leader of this mutiny, right? That Montague's claim to freedom is illegitimate in the eyes of all of these white men. And that's why they keep hunting him down. We have far exceeded the economic calculation of slavery and how much it cost to purchase him. We are now in the philosophical and moral territory. I mean, even Benjamin Franklin wades in and says, well, maybe he was being used by the English, right, to kind of, disrupt America's claim demands for freedom, right? That's why they took this American ship away, right? That Montague has to be rewritten into a moral and philosophical order that always makes Black claims for freedom illegitimate. That's why they went to so much trouble, far beyond what he was economically worth, right? So that's the answer to the second question. And you'll see that again, by the way, in all of the ways that he's referred to in the archive. He's very rarely called Montague in all the letters. It is a beast of a task trying to find letters in the archives about Montague because they call him the Black Prince, the Black Gentleman, the Young African, Mr. Montague, your Black Gentleman, right? Like he is and it's all these like supposedly respectable, right, titles of nobility, but which are always dripping in sarcasm. Because Temple Franklin writes, he is not willing to let himself be governed by me. This boy would not, he just kept claiming that freedom was his right and his due. And these white men forever saw that as illegitimate, right? So that's why they went into so much trouble to get him back. Very quickly, do I feel kinship to Montague? I mean, I do, but I feel like he would be like, no, like you are not my kin, or like I don't know you. It is that intimacy between past and present, that too easy intimacy between past and present. I also feel kinship to Montague, not only because he was Black, not only because he was navigating all this in France, but also because he's a child, right? And there's a way that there's a kind of a protective tendency, especially with this project. All these people are children, right? Working through slavery. And it is so hard to sit here as an adult today and not be deeply affected by what possibly an 8-year-old is going through, potentially expiring, right? Like gasping for breath in a prison dungeon because he had the audacity to run away. I try not to sever that kinship that I feel. I'm like, maybe it'll be productive in my telling. Maybe there's a part of me that comes into the writing. And I think that's what happens with my second finding aid. I very rarely put myself into my writing. I like that academic detachment. But Montague as a chapter is defying that, right? He's not letting me do that. And I'm hoping that kinship that I feel will be productive.
Thank you. Wow, we're gonna invite people who are on campus with us at the Black Studies Summer School to come to the front of the room and ask questions if you have them. We have some great comments in the chat as well.
Yep, we have something here in the classroom.
Hi there. My name is Pablo Herrera. I'm a postdoc here at Scarborough. And it's incredible and a fantastic talk that you just gave us. And it's like super inspiring. And besides the fact that you're brilliant. But I think the obsession that that this men have with Montague is similar to the obsession that police and capitalism has with Black people in general and Black men in particular. And that's like kind of like a side commentary to the idea of the finding aid, so with which you finish. I think this is kind of like a general question, but I'd like to hear your comments on what do you feel that arrives at the archives at the end of it, ultimately, for all of us who are working on archives, and also, this idea of the finding aids with respect to, propositions of vernacular or non-institutional archives. What should we do to actually continue the practice of archives on ourselves and what we need to do in terms of us understanding historiography, right, through us? But ultimately, what exactly should be the kind of finding aids that we should do or use today in the present, in your opinion?
Oh my God. Okay. Thank you for these excellent questions. I always do this, right? Like I open up this kind of work. So I'm like, oh, and then the archive, and people ask me questions. I'm like, oh, I'm just a literary scholar. I'm not a historian. So I don't know. but let me say this. So, but I benefit a great deal from talking to historians and thinking with historians. I am very much indebted to Jessica Marie Johnson for, feedback on some of this work. And she said to me, very, very nicely and kindly as she is, she said, well, where's your Afro-diasporic theoretical framework, right? Because I'm like, let's talk about enlightenment and how Montague destabilizes man and, happiness and liberty. And she's like, where's African diaspora in your theoretical framework? And I'm like, oh, now here, so I'm going to get your question, right? About what is ultimately at the end of the archives? What do we do? How do we think about archives in different ways or alternate archives? One of the directions I want to take this reading in for several reasons. One, Afro-diasporic theoretical framework. Two, how to think about the child. And three, how to think about play, this child who likes to mess with people. I want to turn to Ishiwelegua as a kind of a theoretical grounding for me, right? So if you think about Yoruba sort of religious cosmology, right? If you think about Ishiwelegua, who's the trickster figure at the crossroads, figured as a child, right? So this boy is on the run. He is a child and he is really destabilizing and messing with so many things, right? That there is that playfulness, but it is always in the deadly conditions of slavery, right? When I read, folk tales about Ishu, he will play with, like, it's all fun and games. And at the end of the game, like, half of the people are dead, and you're like, oh, okay, right? Like it gets really serious, like it escalates, right? But there is that interplay between what is frivolous and what is grave. I think issue is what allows us to arrive at the archives, not with the interpretive frameworks that white European Enlightenment man has, for us, that we in turn bring back to the archives, but to think about how we move through archival documents, archival objects, archival spaces, also through Afro-diasporic intellectual frameworks. So I want to think about the crossroads. I want to think about issue. I want to think about the child, the rascal, the trickster, and how all of those would allow us to unsettle what is happening, in this really violent archive. It will not get us to repair or redress. I don't make those claims. Some people make those claims in their work, and I think that it's good to turn to those works as well. But I am much more modest in what I expect to be able to do in the face of an archive of such violence, right? The magnitudes of violence. I mean, I told you that I found Montague's letter in the APS. What I didn't tell you is that I had like Taylor Swift blasting really loud in earphones. I don't listen to Taylor Swift, but I needed something to pull me into as a contemporary, a present as possible. Because the day before I found Montague, I found Boyce, who is gonna be, in the introductory chapter, who is raped repeatedly on the deck of a slave ship, right? Boyce, who during the Middle Passage, where the ship on which she is traveling is being uprooted, transported, is being pursued, right, by the Navy, she screams so loudly that the captain goes down in the hold and chops her up into pieces, right? Like, I don't know how to move through. Like, when I got there, I came to a standstill, because it didn't just happen in the moment that story is recounted. It happens also now in my finding it in the archive. And again now, in my relaying the story to you. How do we move through such narratives of violence? It certainly isn't by thinking about enlightenment and liberty and happiness, at least not for me, right? I have to think about issue. I have to think about the slipperiness, the playfulness, about all of the ways that these children are nudging us to think about our world in a different way because of the particular kinds of violence to which they are subjected in their moment, right? We get back to, I can't remember, I think Aisha or someone's question, right, about the political imperative, right? That for me is part of the political imperative. So I know that it sounds like a bit of a convoluted answer to your question, but for me, it is a question of arriving armed to the archive with frameworks that come from outside of the violent regimes. And I know it's a little bit weird to say, well, to think about Israel Legua as outside of the violent regime of slavery, but in some ways, that's kind of where I anchor those religious and spiritual practices that I then turn to as intellectual frameworks.
Just amazed every time you speak. I'm just very in awe of everything that you're sharing with us. This has been so wonderful and generous. If there are any more questions in the room, I invite participants to come up to the front.
Yes.
Okay, great, wonderful.
Yes, and sorry for the long-winded answers.
No, we're in awe.
Hello, I'm Bianca Bushme. I'm so excited. I'm vigorously nodding. It's given like 2 inches of volume in my hair and this whole talk. I'm vigorously nodding. And you will receive an email from me because we have a lot of things to talk about. Anyways, today, I really, I actually want to, and this is really weird because I'm sort of fangirling but I want to push back on something that you said. That is, when you look at the archives, you already have, or when you look at stuff, you already have sort of like a gendered analysis that you could sort of like posit to certain texts or certain archives that you read, but that you don't necessarily have. You weren't thinking about a framework that was looking at age. And I wanted to maybe interrogate that a little bit in terms of like Montague, to think about like boyhood, like what does gender have to do in this particular sort of setting, right? Like I think there's, when we're talking about world making and self-making and Black self-making and freedom, like I think there's a particular way, there's a particular type of masculinity that's being not only portrayed from the enslavers and the other, there's a particular kind of sense that they have to like snide, right? To be like, oh, this is just a young boy, or he's not that young, but we're still sort of superior. But then there's a particular way of like playing with boyhood, right? That I think, especially with the mischievousness of how he speaks in the letter and just his actions, right? And I think there's like such I guess it's not a pushback, but like an invitation to really sort of interrogate how like Black masculinity and Black boyhood is being sort of created in that moment. And especially when we like look back at like what's just around the corner that's going to happen. We have the French Revolution that's about to happen. We have a lot of stuff that there's a lot of remaking and thinking about these like larger sort of identity markers, but more than that, like just structural ways of like how we categorize according to race, but according to freedom and unfreedoms and gender. Yeah. Thank you.
That is such a great question, a great comment, a great invitation. And it is one that I really struggle with. Like, I'm gonna be really honest with you, right? I keep, I'm always about, like acknowledging my intellectual debts. And so, I'll acknowledge again here my intellectual debts to Jessica Marie Johnson, who was like, well, if Montague was a girl, right? That claim he makes about running away with a man who said he was going to make him happy, right? He désire faire mon bonheur. He desires to make my happiness. Like, we would know how to read that. We would have an intellectual framework for reading that. What do you do with the fact that he's a boy, right? With the implicitly sexualized language in his descriptions of Tessier, right? He says, Monsieur Tessier gentilhomme qui désire faire mon bonheur, right? He desires to make me happy. What do we do with that? How do we think about the illicit intimacy there, right? And so what I'm trying to do is to fold that reading of both age and gender of boyhood into that analysis of the nature of the relationship that we, again, will never know, but the nature of the relationship between Montague and this mysterious older man, right, who promises to take him away and make him happy. That we cannot, in the affective economy of slavery, thinking about Sarah Ahmed and affective economies, we cannot evacuate that language of happiness of its potential for violence and abuse, right? And so that there are ways that we think about an enslaved boy's relationship with an older man and about the kind of, potential for violence and abuse that continue to be embedded within even his discourse and imagining of happiness, even what is possible for him in terms of happiness. That's one of the places in which I want to kind of turn to how one entwines gender and age. The other place I want to turn that to think about that is the kind of access that Montague had, right? So in the next chapter, one people I'm writing about is Eureka, and the chapter begins as follows, unless my editor again is gonna be like, absolutely not, right? The chapter begins, the greatest tragedy of Eureka's life is that a white man would not love her, right? If you've read the story Eureka by Claire de Duras, right? She just kind of like wastes away in a convent because she fell in love with a white man and he would not love her back. And that is the entire story of this Black girl's life in France. It is entirely, so her life story is cast entirely in the context of marriage and domesticity and the way that her Blackness forecloses that. Montague runs through space. The boy is in Scotland and Ireland and Belgium and France and England and everywhere. Montague has access to forms of knowledge that we don't really see, right, with enslaved girls, at least with the ones that I'm talking about in the book, who are often, kind of cast in the space of domesticity. And so there too, I want to think about the ways that Montague works through the kind of access that his gender affords him to make claims to, but also disrupt the very gendered, supposedly universal notion of man. Right. So there it involves a bit of a digression into like, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Émile and the making of the white child and how the making of the male child becomes this project, right? This white enlightenment project of citizenship. How is Montague working within that, but also disrupting that? And how is he able to do that, particularly through his access as a boy? right? So those are the two spaces. But I feel like, from your question and your invitation, there are other points and other openings that you see for thinking through gender and age. I would love to hear more about that, because again, this is new for me, right? Like you all, if you've read my work, you've read Reimagining Liberation. I work on 20th century Black women, right? So thinking about Black boyhood in the 18th century is new territory for me. And I'd love to hear more from folks who've been thinking about this for a while as well. What are other openings that you see either in this project or in your own work?
We have a question from one of our co-organizers in the chat. Rachel Goff asks, fantastic talk and inspiring energy and citational practices. I'm wondering, what does it mean to read age across time, from now to then, but also between the enslaved children of the Caribbean, the unchilded, to think with Spillers. I'm thinking also about Cindy Katz's ideas about the construction of childhood as surplus in the present.
I mean, you all asking such great questions. I'm like, I'm not ready. Let me think about it. I mean, so to be honest, this is where my thinking is going next, right? This is where my reading is going next. Like I said, Habiba Ibrahim's Black Age is next on my reading list to start to think about how we think about childhood and age, across time and in ways that disrupt time as well. So Rachel, I don't really have an answer for you. I'm going to be really honest. I don't have an answer for you yet. Hopefully I will have one answer for you next week when I'm done reading the book. But I would say maybe my preliminary thoughts, I have to think about this a little bit more, because your question is prompting me to think about the fact that I've been reading Montague through a very US American intellectual framework for now, because he was so much in the orbit of these American statesmen, that I haven't actually thought about what it means to think about his childhood in the context of the Caribbean. So I have to go back and think more about that. I'm gonna go and look at Cindy Katz's work, and if you have any other suggestions for me, I'm a happy taker. But yeah, I will say for now, I don't know, but that's where my thinking is going next.
Fantastic. It looks like Mark is in the room. Might have a question as well.
Yep. I have more of a comment.
Okay.
And I have a really easy question. I'll have the easiest question.
Oh, thank you.
But what's sitting with me is this idea of boasting about being from Jamaica. In 1780, and I'm thinking about the first Maroon treaties and how that news might carry to someone who seems to have been literate or is clearly highly mobile. And I'm just wondering how that might play into how you think about the historian's context. I'm sorry to go into the historian's context, but I think that news is coming to Canada. That news is coming to a bunch of different places through newspapers and ships and all that sort of stuff. So for me, that both sounds like he knows something about either the Maroons or the British trying to negotiate freedom in another way. So my question is actually one around process and method, and the terribleness of archives. And I just wondered, where does Derek Walcott come in for you in terms of the process? So, you're spending years traveling to different archives. I actually have two comments and questions, because I'm for me, Walcott's breaking the vase provocation is just life-giving when you're digging through these papers and you're like, I'm trying, what am I doing? What am I finding? And when you go to multiple archives, of course, the finding aids are never usually helpful. So what I really appreciated, so my first question was about, when does Walcott come in? Because to me, that's somewhat of a theoretical framework also. But the second part of my question is more around thinking about these finding aids. So I love that you created 3 finding aids, or you provided 3 finding aids for us. And I read them as the kind of glue on the vase. But I'm more interested in what those finding aids tell us about the limits of knowledge production and the limits of even academic work, 200, 300 years later, and what we should take from that as people working in the field.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So let's see. Let me start with Jamaica, the Maroon treaties. I mean, I guess what I will say is that Montague, the geography that he constructs, allows us to see him as a really savvy reader of world events, right? Or at least Atlantic events. I don't think it's a coincidence that his two claims to genealogy and origin, to place and location, are Jamaica and then Saint-Domingue, also on the eve of revolution, right? That Montague is maybe strategically selecting these places that are very much sort of at the forefront of challenging imperial power in the Atlantic world, right? And that with that, though, comes then his ability to always root his identity claims in the really shifting sands of Atlantic revolutions, right? So that essentially what ends up happening is that Montague could be from anywhere in the moment that it suits his legal purpose. Which is a different orientation to place and belonging, I think, than we would maybe ordinarily read it, right? As that kind of affective, affective calling of place. This is where I'm from, this is where I belong, this is why I keep trying to return there, right? That Montague, I think, is making these really strategic legal claims. And he's doing so at a strategic time too, right? Like, remember, all of these ships he gets on, they never arrive where they're supposed to arrive because there are so many shenanigans going on, right? Like, England is trying to undermine France's maritime presence and power. The United States is trying to break away from England, right? Like, everybody, there's this world making that's happening. And Montague says, I'm going to make my own world order within that, right? The ordering of my world, which gets us to your question about the finding aid, which I think about as the ordering of our knowledge. Or at least the ordering of our access to the past. The thing that is interesting is that even when we think that ordering is sacred and intact, it isn't really. One of the things I wanted to do to get to the limits of academic work is I wanted to also incorporate interviews within the chapter with archivists to ask them, like, how do these archives come to be? I don't know that I'm going to do that, but I've talked to the archivists. And one of the things they told me was that Franklin and Temple Franklin's papers, they actually cannot tell me what belongs to which, because those collections that seem intact and sacred now in the finding aids, right? The complete finding aid for Franklin, complete whole distinct finding aid for Temple Franklin at the APS, those collections have actually been unbound and rebound and merged and disentangled so many times from the 18th century, to such a degree that they found a letter in Benjamin Franklin's archive, and the second page was in Temple Franklin's archive, completely different call numbers, right? So, like, even when we think those things are intact, so what does the finding aid mean then for ordering our knowledge and our access to the past, when even in an archive that I think of as intact as Benjamin Franklin's, right, becomes so loose and untethered. And then what does that mean then for finding someone like Montague, who appears really only in the interstices of these letters and bills of exchange and correspondence, which gets us then to the limit of academic work. For me, that the limit primarily that I see is in form, right? That I can't really account for all of my nascent thinking about the fugitive account in strictly academic terms and academic language. That's why there's that kind of like semi-creative writing at the end in terms of the finding aid. That's why there's an incorporation of interviews, possibly. Another thing that's happening in the chapter is that depending on which century I'm talking about, I refer to him as Montague or as Jean. And the chapter is written in one font or a different font. My poor editor. Right. And it's like really confusing and just right, because I want to signal even visually, right, the jarring, discordant moves between past and present, right? All of those ways, again, for signaling the limits of academic work and its fictions of coherence, of wholeness, right, that we have to strive for, even in the face of fragmentation. So that's maybe sort of my initial stab at your question about this work. I hope I got to all three parts of the question, but yeah, those are my initial thoughts so far.
The last question was just, the first question was about Walcott in your trajectory.
Oh, like, yes.
Do you find him after 2 years in the archives, or do you go back to him after 3 months, or how does he help you in the archive?
Right. So Walcott, I don't even know how I began with Walcott in this chapter. I mean, so right now that portion of the Nobel Prize speech serves as the epigraph to the chapter, with Break a Vase kind of anchoring, the reading, and then emerging finally as kind of like a call and response refrain in the third finding aid. So what Walcott helps me to do is to think about a relationship between historical analysis and literary interpretation in a way that is not antagonistic, because Walcott is writing about really, when you talk about the vase, he's writing about like a ceremony, a festival, right? That happens, in the Caribbean, that kind of becomes this merging of all of these different shards of cultures that come to meet in the Caribbean and in that historical moment. And so, for me, what he helps me to do is to think about literature and history in a way that is not antagonistic. That is my primary goal. I do not want to alienate historians. I found it I'm not even a historian, but I find it alienating to read text that's like, well, here's how history falls apart in accounts of Black presence. And I'm like, yes, but also historians have given us so much, right, that we cannot reduce their work to the limits of methodology, right? And so that's really what Walcott helps me to do, is to think across discipline, because ultimately he's a poet, right? And there's no more discipline kind of crossing, genre bending, I think, form of expression than poetry. And so Walcott helps me to think about history and literature, to think about method and process, and also to think about turning to an Afro-diasporic form, right? Which is the call and response refrain, which is ultimately how I incorporate Break a Vase into the chapter. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you.
Sure.
I know that we have gone a little bit over time, but when we have one more question in the chat, and so perhaps we'll pose that, and then we'll wrap up for the morning. But Katrina Eve Manica asks, or says, the arrival and disappearance from the archives in Ireland is also an interesting moment, particularly as Ireland has an imperial identity to Britain, and then also white skin privilege for those Irish who went to the US and other imperial locations as enslavers. I'm wondering if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, that is a great question. So the way that I come to this question is actually, to maybe piggyback up the previous question about archives, is through the archive, right? So what I'm trying to do now is to find Montague after Kinsale. After the ship gets carried away to Kinsale, what happens? Where does he go? So far, we haven't found him. And so I'm asking the archivist, well, what do I do? So I've contacted like the archives in Ireland, and she's like, well, at that time, Ireland was part of the British Empire, right? So now I have to like do a search in the British National Archives, right? So like already where one might locate Montague in Ireland, right, is actually very much linked to the empire, right, the imperial center. That's where that information or data would be. So even just the fact of that being housed at the National Archives in London, I think is for me very indicative, right, of that the legacy of that imperial relationship between Ireland and England. Let's see, white skin privilege for Irish went to the US and other. Yeah, I mean, beyond that, so yeah, I have to try to imagine, I guess, what the world in Ireland would have looked like for a Black boy. What would he have blended into, right? Like on the Irish coast as a deckhand of sorts, and then find a way to smuggle himself back to Passy, get himself back to England, right? So like it's not entirely clear to me what Ireland looks like for a Black person in the 18th century. And that's, I think, part of that kind of like historical world building that piece I have to put together to speculate on what happens to Montague. But I think in keeping with the spirit of the chapter, what I ultimately want to do is to stand in a posture of hesitation before my inability to ever know what happens to him in Kinsale. So I'm resisting trying to do that critical fabulation, right? What would the world have looked like in Ireland? How might we speculate? where Montague ends up or what happens next, that I want to stand and figure out, as Stephen Best asked, what is occasioned by the loss of that piece of the broken vase, right? What might we learn or take away? How might we read differently, think differently by standing in that space, not only of the unknown, but of the unknowable? So that's really how I come to Ireland, is by saying, well, what is the value of what I cannot know about what's happening here? So yeah.
This is incredible. This is such incredible work. It's been such a privilege to spend time with you today and this morning, and just to have this glimpse into your new project and new work. So just on behalf of everybody, I just love to thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much, so very much for having me, for the really insightful and thought-provoking questions. I'm going to be sitting with all of them for a while. And please, you're welcome to email me. I would really love to continue the conversation. I know that you all are having amazing generative conversations, and I would love to be part of that, even vicariously. So, please don't hesitate to be in touch if that would be of interest or of use to you all. But again, thank you all so much for having me here.
Oh man, thank you. You're so kind. You're so wonderful. And yeah, we're just thrilled. We're over the moon. And so thank you all to everybody who's been able to join us online. And we wish you all just a wonderful Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yes. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.